Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to install a front Bumpsteer kit on a Honda S2000. A front Bumpsteer kit is a spacer that raises your steering rack and corrects the tie rod geometry on lowered cars. Let's get to it. The first thing you want to do is jack up the car and get it on jack stands. You'll want to ensure the front of the car is high enough such that you can fit underneath it and work comfortably. Once the car is on jack stands, you're going to want to loosen the steering rack coupler so that the steering rack has some mobility. Use a 10mm socket with an extension to remove the lower steering rack coupler bolt and loosen the upper steering rack coupler bolt. These two bolts are located at different angles, so you will need to turn the wheels in order to rotate the steering shaft. This should allow the coupler to move around, but it should not disconnect from the rack. While you're underneath the car, you'll also want to remove the front splash shield. It is held in place with 7 push clips and 2 bolts. Use a 10mm socket to remove the 2 bolts and a flathead screwdriver or clip removal tool to remove the push clips. If your push clips are original, don't be surprised if you break a few, as they become quite brittle over time. In order to access one of the steering rack bolts, you'll need to remove the lower radiator hose bracket. Slide the radiator hose off of the bracket and then use a 10mm socket, a universal joint, and an extension to remove the single bolt securing the bracket in place. It's easiest to do this with 1/4-inch sockets, but should be possible with 3/8-inch sockets. The next thing you want to do is remove the air intake so that you can easily reach the steering rack bolts. If you need help doing that, I've got videos that will be linked down below. Now you can unbolt the steering rack. Use a 14mm socket, a universal joint, and a long extension to remove the 4 bolts securing the steering rack to the subframe. As you remove each bolt from the steering rack, transfer the washer from the old bolt to the new longer bolt and insert the new longer bolt into place. It is important to do this now since the 2 forwardmost bolts won't fit into the steering rack when the spacers are in place. Finally, you can install the spacers. Lift one side of the steering rack at a time until you can create enough clearance for one of the spacers to slide in between the steering rack and the subframe. I found it easiest to wedge one end of the spacer in and wiggle it until the bolt drops in. Then you can swing the other side of the spacer into place until its respective bolt drops in as well. With the spacers in place, you can bolt up the steering rack. Use a 14mm socket, a universal joint, and a long extension to install the 4 bolts securing the steering rack to the subframe. Torque the bolts to 32 foot-pounds. Since you're done with the bolts, you can reinstall the air intake. If you need help doing that, I've got videos that will be linked down below. Insert the lower radiator hose bracket into place and ensure that the tab fits into the hole on the bottom side of the cross member beam. Use a 10mm socket, a universal joint, and an extension to reinstall the single bolt securing the bracket in place. Torque it to 7.2 foot-pounds. Then slide the radiator hose back onto the bracket. With that done, you can reinstall the front splash shield. Mount the splash shield into place and then use a 10mm socket to reinstall the 2 bolts securing it in place. Reinstall the 7 push clips as well. If you broke some push clips during removal, this is a good time to install some fresh new clips. Use a 10mm socket and an extension to tighten the upper steering rack coupler bolt and reinstall the lower steering rack coupler bolt. These 2 bolts are located at different angles, so you will need to turn the wheels in order to rotate the steering shaft. Torque the 2 bolts to 16 foot-pounds. The last thing to do is lower the car back down to the ground and proceed to get in alignment so that you don't have any adverse tire wear. Shout out to Scott for providing a donor car for this video. If you found this video helpful, please give this video a thumbs up, and if you're located in the Bay Area and looking to have some work done in your car, feel free to DM me on Instagram.